All right, so I just ventured into the belly of the beast and made it back out alive. I think. I feel the same as I did a couple weeks ago, but let's talk about it. So I just wrapped up a short trip out to Washington, D.C. for the NATO 75th Anniversary Summit. In today's video, we're going to talk about some background there, like why I was invited, the pros and cons from my perspective of the creator program they're kind of putting together. We're going to dive into some specific questions I was able to ask of senior leaders on site, step back for a little bigger picture view, some key takeaways from the summit, and then wrap up answering a couple of your specific questions. Now, starting out, this is something I've talked about on this channel as well as across social media. I was invited probably 6 or 7 months ago by a marketing agency that was hired by NATO to take part in this program, where essentially NATO is trying to reach out to creators that are in this space or adjacent to this space to help inform a broader audience about what NATO is. I know I'm coming from a biased perspective here because I've been a part of it, but I think they've gone about it in a really good way in that they cover travel and lodging. So for me at this point, it means travel and lodging to Brussels, to the headquarters for the 75th anniversary ceremony, to an aircraft carrier off the coast of France, to Miami to speak at the NATO Youth Summit, and now to the summit, 75th anniversary summit in Washington, D.C. There's no fee. They don't pay us. There's no channel sponsorships or really promotion, anything like that, really through NATO. Where I think they've done this very, very well, and I've actually talked to other brands about doing something similar, is they've just been hands-off in terms of what you say, what you create, anything like that. So like this video is not being vetted by NATO before, during, or after publication. It's entirely my words, and I think they do a really good job kind of promoting that. And it does kind of speak to the confidence of the organization, right? When they're able to say, come on in this case, 32 different creators, come on in, record what you want, talk about what you want, say what you want, and that's that. There's been, at this point, nobody's contacted me after the fact. It's been a few months now to say, take this video down, adjust this video in any way, shape, or form. You don't actually get that with brands. For all the brands I've worked with, it's multiple iterations of you have to say this a different way, put different text in the description. So it's unique that NATO is so hands-off, like just come in, record, talk, share. I think that's worth mentioning. Now, this was covered in the Washington Post, and we're going to start with some of the background here. Taylor Lorenz contacted me and a handful of the others after the first day for kind of some questions about what this whole program looked like, and they wrote an article titled, "NATO's Newest Weapon is Online Content Creators." So they invited 15, NATO invited 15, that's the program that I was a part of, from around the world, NATO member countries. The State Department invited 15 others from, I believe, just the United States. We, for the most part, did everything together, stayed in different hotels, and kind of the process of organizing the events were different. But once we got on site, it was essentially the 30 all together at all times, for the most part. So one experience should generally mirror the other. Now, looking at the article put together here, because I think it actually presented this program pretty well, they said NATO is covering the content creators' travel expenses, including transportation, hotels, and meals, perks most journalistic organizations would decline. It is not paying fees for the creators to create specific content and has no editorial control over the content they produce. I have mixed feelings on that because on the one hand, I completely agree. This isn't something, they wouldn't pay CNN or BBC or Reuters to go to the NATO summit. On the other hand, those major organizations have the funding and the budget to be able to do that, and there were tons of reporters on site being paid to be there by their organization. If they would have invited, if they just said, you can come to this event, I'm not sure that I would have traveled there, picked up airfare and lodging for 3-4 days to be able to cover this on scene in this same manner. So it removes a barrier. However, I do understand it's a fair critique by Taylor Lorenz here that this is something that traditional media outlets wouldn't do. So worth keeping that in mind. And then they called us out. We made it. All of us were in the Washington Post. They said Preston Stewart, a YouTuber with more than 707,000 subscribers who makes content about the military and serves in the U.S. Army Reserve, said this week's summit is his 4th event with NATO, including one where he and other creators were brought aboard an aircraft carrier off the coast of France. Stewart has said that NATO has always given him editorial independence, allowing him, for example, to ask military leaders about the North Atlantic Fellow Organization, a group of internet activists who raise money for Ukraine and combat pro-Russian messaging about the war. There's never been any take this down, edit this, say any more of that, like I was mentioning before. So with that, let's dive right into one of the first interviews here. This one was with Admiral Bauer. So I happened to see him coming out of one of the events. We'd spoken when I was in Brussels and decided to share something with him that somebody put together online. Here with Admiral Bauer, just showed him his NATO, his dog, sir.
It's amazing. To have my own NATO dog figure, it's much more beautiful than I am myself, so it's an honor to be in the gallery of all the animals of NATO. So thank you for the creators, and good luck with all the important work.
So in all honesty, that was probably my favorite interaction of this entire trip. Look, Admiral Bauer was genuinely excited to see this thing. He wasn't faking it. He was smiles the whole time. He brought his staff over. They looked at it. They loved it. They remembered our conversation in Brussels about kind of asking him about NATO and how that had picked up a lot of traction online. And I know that it meant a lot to the guy who actually made this thing halfway around the world that Admiral Bauer actually sees it and says thank you. So this, to me, is actually a really good encapsulation of why they're putting this program together. As silly as that question in this little short clip looks, it connects with a certain audience. It connects with an online audience in a way that, CNN, Reuters, BBC, they're not able to. So it adds some personality, from my perspective, to an organization that otherwise feels just like a thing. No, it's a person. People like Admiral Bauer that have, a sense of humor and can joke and can laugh and can understand what's going on the internet. So again, this was probably my favorite part of the entire experience. But that does raise some other aspects I wanted to get into here, which was a personal concern. And I posted a video about this right away as soon as I got on site, influence over the content and what they were going to say you can or can't produce. I was a little more confident this time going in because that hasn't been a thing at all in the past. But they did line up because we were kind of doing this NATO and state alongside one another. They lined up some events that I hadn't been a part of before. We went to the Pentagon. We went to the White House. And as soon as I saw the White House was on the agenda, I thought, I got nervous. Like, how are they going to present this and maybe push us in one way or the other? What are they going to talk about? Fortunately, it was very nonpartisan, I think is the best way to put it. The White House tour was the public tour. So we just had some random people in there with us. It wasn't really, it was cool to see the White House. Wasn't necessarily any unique treatment or anything like that. We did then get kind of some one-on-one time with National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby, which was certainly unique in a couple different settings. That started out with his team saying, please don't record him and just have cameras shoved in his face. And then he walked in and said, turn those cameras on. I'm used to this at all times, which I should mention that I essentially could have had a GoPro on start to finish. There was only one time throughout this entire event, and I'll get into it here in a minute, where they actually said, off the record, you can't publish what we're going to talk about here in a second, but I'll get to that. So I wanted to jump into the John Kirby interview here. This took place just after a Russian missile strike or a Russian missile impacted a children's hospital in Ukraine. I was seeing a lot of comments about that, so I thought it was worth addressing with John Kirby.
A deadly missile strike in Kyiv this week. We're still seeing pictures of the civilians, women and children, being pulled from the rubble. And my understanding is there's been no change to the guidance as to what Ukraine can target with Western munitions. If this didn't change it, what will it take to provide Ukraine the authority to use things like the ATACMS to strike Russian airfields that are being used in a military capacity to wage this war?
Well, look, I don't want to speculate one way or another. We're in constant communication with the Ukrainians, literally every day, and the president will be meeting with President Zelensky tomorrow to talk about making sure we're meeting their needs. And those needs, yes, those needs are about munitions and weapons, but it is also about guidelines. It's about support that we can provide, and we're going to have those conversations every single day. And out of those discussions came an additional decision to let them target Russian imminent threats right across the border, and they've used that to good effect. We have provided them ATACMS as a longer range. It's allowing them to strike targets deeper behind Russian lines, which has also had a significant impact. But we're going to keep the conversation going with them. I don't have a decision to announce one way or the other. I would only end with this, because it's a really good question and it's a valid one. The president has, from the very beginning of this conflict, said we're going to support Ukraine. We're going to stand up with our NATO allies. But the third thing he always says is we've got to make sure we don't let this conflict escalate to the point where it becomes World War III. Because I think we could all agree that that kind of escalation between the United States and Russia, two nuclear powers, could be catastrophic, not just for the Ukrainian people, but for the entire European continent. So we're watching that, we're monitoring that, but those conversations with the Ukrainians keep happening.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time, sir. Very much appreciate it.
Thank you.
So here's the deal. Nothing groundbreaking there, and that's kind of helps to paint the context of these overall interactions. It's good to be able to ask these specific questions, from my perspective, of senior leaders like Kirby or Admiral Bauer or, in a minute here, General Ryder. But you have to understand that we're not going to get some groundbreaking news, right? This was not an occasion where Kirby was going to go off the rails and say, well, actually, you know what? If they just A, B, and C, then Ukraine is going to be able to strike whatever they want, however they want. We know that's not going to happen. These are professionals that are constantly dealing with reporters that are trying to trip them up. So they have to be very, very careful in what they say. So, nothing groundbreaking by a long shot. In all honesty, most of you following this war probably could have expected that answer that Kirby was about to give. It was relatively canned, all things considered, and that does cycle into a bit of the downside, I'll say, about all of this. It's great to be able to ask specific questions that I think you all are interested in of some of these folks and get their answers. The downside is it's not really going to be breaking any news, right? In the Kirby interview here is just a great example. So you have to recognize that going in. I'm getting better at recognizing that and not expecting more than, again, the kind of relatively canned response we get from Kirby in this situation. Now, I mentioned earlier that there was a portion off record. Now, this had to do with a Pentagon visit. There were about 4 or 5 of us. They peeled off and sent over to the Pentagon, which was great. Haven't been there since 2007, 2008. Went there for some school trips with West Point. But it was cool. Actually ran into a couple people, recognized in the hallway and in the main event. Adrian here, actually. We got to pull up Adrian. Adrian was a combat cameraman in the Army. Got out, said he bounced around between a couple jobs and couldn't find that camaraderie, that close-knit brotherhood that he felt in the Army, or sense of purpose, sense of mission. He now works at the Pentagon, said he loves his job. He's the one who keeps the lights on and kind of runs the Pentagon press conferences. He's a former Army combat cameraman. He came over to say hi. I just thought that was so cool. Like, what a good path he's found, and his military service led him to that. So it was awesome getting to meet Adrian and a couple other folks there. Now, we sat in this press briefing, just the typical Pentagon press briefing with General Ryder, Major General Pat Ryder. And the handful of questions came in there. We kind of sat in the back because it was all the official reporters up front doing their thing. When the session ended, I guess there's a portion, learned this in real time, General Ryder comes off the podium, the lights kind of change, and he says, okay, everything is off the record. What background information do you want? And I don't know if that's normal for most events or if it was unique to the Pentagon or unique to General Ryder. I was able to ask a question during that portion because we were kind of allowed to interact at that point as content creators and not just journalists. Thought it was better than nothing. Also recognizing I wasn't going to be able to share it with you all. Fortunately, after that, and it also wasn't anything crazy, but then we veered off into a private room where we were able to have a one-on-one with General Ryder, and I just asked that question again in a situation where it was completely on the record and open book. So the off the record, again, it wasn't anything. Really, it ended up being the exact same as what I was able to ask him on the record. And what I asked General Ryder was, we're seeing a lot of focus in Ukraine right now about air defense. A major focus at the summit was sending more air defense munitions and launchers to Ukraine to try to protect their cities and their troops at the front line. A year ago, most of the conversation was about the ongoing Ukrainian counteroffensive. That really hasn't been a talk. Again, Patriots, NASAMS are the focal point, not Bradleys, Abrams, and Leopards. You can't retake territory with air defense and long-range precision munitions. You need troops on the ground. We're really not hearing that conversation right now. So I asked, is that suggesting that the priority right now is kind of protecting Ukraine versus allowing Ukraine what they need to retake territory, or is that reading too much between the lines? He said, when it comes to the equipment sent to Ukraine, of course, there is a window of what we can and can't, right? The U.S. at this point is not sending like F-22s, F-35s, even F-16s from the U.S. aren't on the table, from my understanding. So there's like a range of what we can and are sending. When it comes to that range, what goes over is directly related to what Ukraine is asking for. So when we see a spike in asks for air defense, or the U.S. and Germany and the U.K. and all of NATO talking about sending more air defense, that is, according to General Ryder, has much more to do with what Ukraine is asking for than what NATO is saying we have available and are going to send, if that makes sense. So the reason that air defense has been such a priority in recent months is because it's a priority to Ukraine. And then NATO and all of NATO allies are the ones answering that call, and then air defense is in the news. I thought that was interesting. Again, kind of trying to read between the lines as to what the focus is for this conflict in the near and long term. Now, I did want to spend a few moments here before getting into a couple of your specific questions, talking to the higher level summit, some key takeaways. They put together a declaration out of any one of these summits. It's kind of long. If you want to read it, I'll link it in the description below if you want to check that out. But there were a couple pieces here that I thought were worth calling out specifically. They said, quote, Russia remains the most significant and direct threat to allies' security. Terrorism, in all its forms and manifestations, is the most direct asymmetric threat to the security of our citizens and to international peace and prosperity. So nothing out of the ordinary there, just kind of reiterating, again, that the kind of focus for NATO is the threat that Russian aggression poses. They said, quote, we reiterate that hybrid operations against NATO allies could reach the level of an armed attack and could lead the North Atlantic Council to invoke Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. That's big. This is one of those conversations where when you think about Article 5, it's a missile lands in London, and all of a sudden the allies come together and it's a military response to a military action. But what does that mean when these hybrid threats emerge? Cyber warfare. At what point does a cyber attack constitute an attack justifiable by invoking Article 5 of the Washington Treaty? It's a real concern. And Russia's very, very smart when it comes to all this. Again, look back at the start of the war in 2014, how they were able to take so much territory in the Donbass and Crimea by using these little green men. And we just didn't quite have the right response. It didn't know exactly how to deal with that. Gray zone operations are a hybrid operations, this gray zone space. It's a significant threat all around the world, and it's notable here that NATO is calling that out, saying that could get to the level of requiring a military response. They said, quote, Ukraine's future is in NATO. Ukraine has become increasingly interoperable and politically integrated with the alliance. We reaffirm that we will be in a position to extend an invitation to Ukraine to join the alliance when allies agree and conditions are met. So I think some folks were maybe overly optimistic that Ukraine could be offered NATO membership at this summit. That was never really in the cards at all. Nobody should have been considering that. It's just not the right time. And not the right time as in all of the allies are not going to agree on it. Not the right time. And that's all that really matters here is what the alliance as a whole can come to an agreement on. But I thought it was interesting. They talked about how interoperable Ukraine is becoming with NATO. It's partially militarily, right? A lot of NATO military equipment is being used in Ukraine now, but also on the political and economic front, kind of tying them into the alliance. They get closer and closer every single day to becoming a member. They said, quote, we intend to provide a minimum baseline funding of $40 billion within the next year and to provide sustainable levels of security assistance for Ukraine to prevail, taking into account Ukraine's needs, our respective national budget procedures, and the bilateral security agreements which allies have concluded with Ukraine. So again, kind of a commitment for the years going forward. Ukraine was the focus by and large throughout this entire event. Probably no surprise, but just about every single thing that came up, every single topic, had some aspect of the war in Ukraine and or Russia. So the allies committing here to $40 billion at least for the coming years. And they did add something new here that was worth mentioning where they kind of called out China. They said the PRC has become a decisive enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine through its so-called No Limits Partnership and its large-scale support for Russia's defense industrial base. The PRC cannot enable the largest war in Europe in recent history without this negatively impacting its interest and reputation. And something they really focused in on in the speeches that I was able to listen to was talking about dual-use technology. So China, from what we can tell, isn't sending, overt military equipment like North Korean artillery shells or Iranian drones. It's not there, but they're sending a lot of technology via other means that can be used for military purposes. And it's one of those things where it's happening in such volume that it has to be obvious to China why, certain appliances are being bought in bulk, if you will. And NATO, in this case, in the North Atlantic Council, the opening session there that I was able to sit in on for a piece, they spent some of the few moments during that opening speech calling out China for this very purpose. It actually brings up something else that I wanted to bring up throughout this whole event. And I understand this is at risk of complaining when this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and I'm incredibly grateful to have been there at all. There's an interesting dynamic when you're sitting in some of these speeches of trying to figure out, are you just listening and absorbing the information? Are you recording, right? I want to document so much of this for you all and share it in so many different ways, but it's very hard to record and get good footage myself while also really absorbing what they're saying and being able to ask some sort of follow-on question. So it's an interesting dynamic. I think in a perfect world, I'd have a +1 there to be able to do some of the recording, and I could really just dial in on what's being said. But at least in this context, this event, it was just the individual creator. So little interesting dynamic there that I never really dealt with before. I'm used to when, a general comes in and talks, you put the phone down. You don't touch it. You just listen, 100% attention. But in this situation, we are there to try to capture content, try to relay the information to you. So there's plenty of cases where I need to have my phone out and try to document it for a wider audience. Just a little interesting dynamic, if you will. So we did have a couple questions I wanted to address from you all. These came in from channel members. First one here, actually both of these are like 2-part questions. NATO has mentioned several times that the public shouldn't take peace for granted. Do they really believe Russia would attack NATO? I'm going to tackle that one first. I think what what you're getting at here is that there's a lot that goes into ensuring peace and stability around the world. And I think that at times people think that no action will produce peace, and action produces conflict. And I think what NATO has tried to signal at times is it's a lot of work to keep conflicts from either starting and or escalating around the world. NATO and a bunch of other organizations and countries and diplomats and individuals are constantly working to try to stop war from continuing or getting worse. And I think that goes under the radar because it doesn't happen, right? When the war doesn't happen, it's hard to look at something and say, look at all the work that went into war not happening. So I think that's part of what they're getting at there. They said, what's something you would say the general public has the least correct perception about concerning NATO and its leadership? Article 5, hands down, Article 5. So this is an alliance. Article 5 only comes about, or anything in the alliance only comes about with unanimous support. Not 95%, not 99%, not 51%, 100% support for Article 5. So in a situation, a hypothetical situation where a NATO ally was attacked, that does not automatically mean that the United States and the rest of NATO is at war. The Article 5 has to be invoked, and then the rest of the members have to vote on it it has to be presented, and then the rest of the members have to vote to invoke it. Even then, so let's say that Article 5 is invoked, that does not automatically mean that U.S. troops are on the ground in Europe conducting some sort of offensive operation. Every country, after Article 5 is invoked, has the opportunity to determine how they are going to support the country that's been attacked. The United States, Article 5 could be invoked, and the U.S. could say, we are going to increase grain shipments to your country as our portion of Article 5, and have zero military response at all. So the nature of Article 5 does not automatically mean that if any attack ever happens in Europe, no matter what, that we are in some nuclear war with Russia. There is a lot that has to happen between something that would trigger Article 5 and the U.S., or any other country for that matter, getting directly involved militarily. I mean, the one time that Article 5 has been invoked was after the 9/11 attacks in the United States. And even then, all NATO allies did something, but not all NATO allies had boots on the ground in Afghanistan conducting combat operations. So we don't even have to get hypothetical with this. Like in that very tangible example, Article 5 did not mean that NATO troops around the world coalesced and fought together against some common enemy. It's just, there's a lot more flexibility there than I think most people understand. The next one here, do you think NATO, Ukraine, Europe can count on the U.S. in the future? And if not, are we, Europe, doing enough to make sure we can help Ukraine win and to stop Russia's hybrid warfare, since I'm one of those that thinks Russia would never attack Europe head on? So probably not a big surprise, but throughout this entire event, there's just so much talk about teamwork, the alliance, working together, how we benefit from one another. So, I was in the group there, the group being like the NATO summit, that thinks that NATO is incredibly important going forward. So from their perspective, all they're talking about is how we all can count on one another. Keep that in mind. In terms of should that change and the U.S. become more isolated in a sense, kind of pulling back from abroad, I would say that Europe has and this is entirely projection at this point, right? I would say Europe has enough, the rest of NATO has enough capabilities to keep Ukraine in the fight. But I don't know that Europe, as it sits today, has enough military equipment and resources and defense budget to get Ukraine to the point where they could prevail against Russia. And part of that's challenging because nobody really knows what it's going to take for Ukraine to defeat Russia. And we've seen what the West has been able to provide so far. That wasn't enough, right? If we look at kind of the lead up to the last counteroffensive in the South, the major counteroffensive last summer in the South, that didn't do it. So it's going to have to be more than that. Can Europe meet that demand over time? Sure. I'm sure that they could if that was a singular focus and they really wanted to get there. But that would be a big effort to backfill by the United States. However, again, personal opinion here, I don't know that the United States is all that close to stopping military or economic aid to Ukraine or backing away from NATO. I think there's some very loud voices that talk about that, but when you look at general kind of consensus support for Ukraine, it's still pretty high. And it's not one of the more contentious subjects, even in U.S. politics. So, again, personal take there. But that's about it. That's what I got. NATO summit wrapped up. I think overall, good event. There was never any pressure to say this, that, or the other, record anything or not record anything. So to me, it felt very open. I like that. I mentioned in a video before going that if that changed and there was any sort of censorship or undue influence, if you will, that I would tell you. And I genuinely, from the bottom of my heart, can say that didn't happen. And I'm grateful that didn't happen because I would, not just in light of being a creator, but as an American citizen, I'd be very uneasy if the government was trying to intentionally sway people like myself or others putting out information about certain topics. So good news. I can report that at least in my experience, that wasn't the case at all. But again, thank you all so much for your support. Your being here is what allowed me to be even considered, to be invited as a part of that. And hopefully through, various, lots of posts on Twitter and Instagram and TikTok and here on YouTube throughout this event, hopefully that was valuable. You learned just a little something or had an idea about something that maybe you didn't beforehand. That's the whole goal here, is to just try to present, in this case, the NATO summit to a broader audience. Hopefully we got that done. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.